Welcome to the Retail Focus Podcast, a weekly collection of news, interviews, and information from the world of retail. Here are your hosts, Trent Kling and Leighton Kling.
Welcome to this edition of the Retail Focus Podcast with Trent and Leighton Kling. Plenty of retail stories out there this week. We went slightly off the map with our lead story. We'll get to that in a little bit. We'll also talk for the third consecutive week about the natural and organics grocery space. Natural Grocers produced earnings this week, but also we got word of closures for Earth Fare, and we're going to be talking Simon Property Group on the show as well as a couple of intriguing looking ahead stories. Our interview guest, it's a fantastic interview. I mean, all of our interviews are fantastic, but today I think you're really going to enjoy it. It's Colby McKenzie. He's the principal of Enlighten Wellness. This is a firm that helps to connect retailers with CBD products. We're going to talk about not only CBD products, but also a wide variety of natural and alternative products for wellness and how smaller retailers and independent retailers are learning to adopt those. He's also going to talk about some of their education platforms for consumers as well. Interesting stuff. A reminder, you can check us out on Twitter and Instagram at Retail Podcast. Also, we ask that you like us, rate us, however you access us if you enjoy us, whether that be Apple Podcasts, whether that be Stitcher or Spotify, any other podcast listening service. A couple of notes I wanted to throw out there before we get started with the news portion of the show. Want to give a big shout out to the folks at CBRE. They nominated us for one of the best 15 real estate podcasts that are out there. That came out in a Business Insider article earlier this week. We really appreciate the folks at CBRE doing that. We do cover real estate quite a bit on this show, and as it pertains to retail, we'll be talking about some of that later on in this week's show. And then another note, Leighton, I just wanted to throw this out there because we've talked about this before, but it is about time that this happens. L Brands removes the photo of underwear models at the top of their investor relations page. We've talked about this so often. I think this is a reflective, certainly, of which business is doing better under their portfolio, which is Bath & Body Works, but also we felt like it was about time for this to be removed. We've long thought it was kind of, Bush League a little bit to have that picture atop their investor relations page. It's been replaced with candles, so a lot safer for work if you're just happening to look at their investor relations page while you are at work. So a positive sign from L Brands there. We're going to lead off this show with a retailer we haven't discussed for a while on the podcast, as they released earnings Tuesday of this week. In an ever-consolidating segment, we're talking about the Western wear segment, and the retailer is Boot Barn, who is a leader in that segment. They've grown organically and through acquisition steadily over the past several years. Honestly, we've been kind of lax in acknowledging how good they've been over the last couple of years. Same-store sales for some quarters popping up into the double digits. And for this earnings call, they met on steep earnings per share expectations of 81 cents per share. But we're really talking about them here to catch up on their latest goings-on and initiatives more than the numbers. And Leighton, we wanted to start out with a bit about Boot Barn, since we know quite a bit of our listening audience might not be familiar with the concept overall.
Yeah, that's right. We know a fair amount of our listeners come from the northeastern parts of the U.S. and maybe some in the upper Midwest. So we figured upon giving a quick primer on Boot Barn to start things off would be probably the best option here. So first, they don't sell just boots, of course, but all types of Western apparel. They don't have any locations in Michigan, Ohio, New York, Pennsylvania, and so forth. In fact, Lexington, Kentucky is the furthest northeast they go, so we can excuse a lot of our listeners for being unfamiliar outright with the concept. Their greatest concentration of stores are in Texas and California, which comes as little surprise when you take a close look at the company. In fact, most of their California locations are either in the Inland Empire or agriculture-heavy regions. What Boot Barn does have, however, is 252 stores in 33 states. Again, looking at large concentrations of stores throughout the Midwest, Texas, California. Their stores average about 10,500 square feet in size and are usually typically located as out parcels or hard corners of highly trafficked shopping centers. Additionally, they operate Sheplers, which If some of our listeners think back, it was one time one of the largest Western wear retailers and catalog companies in the U.S. After being purchased by Boot Barn, most Sheplers locations were actually turned into Boot Barn locations, with a few exceptions. You saw some closures around some underperforming Sheplers locations, or even some of the larger Sheplers locations that Boot Barn looked at and said, you know what, those concepts are a little bit too big, a little bit bigger than their around 11,000 square foot average per store. Sheplers, by the way, was notable for unique store architecture. The stores almost looked like a cubist cowboy hat. And honestly, there are a few that Trent, you and I grew up around that were pretty much just that. Additionally, Boot Barn runs the Country Outfitter lifestyle website, so you can go on there and check out their selection. So a wide variety of Western wear apparel, a wide variety of items, and several different banners. So their main competitors, you ask, are in the general merchandise space in some parts of the country, but mainly the likes of Cavender's, which has roughly 80 stores, and other local chains. It also bears noting that several farm and ranch supply stores like Tractor Supply, Orscheln's, Atwood's, Big R, and Fleet Farm, for instance, have increasingly focused on Western apparel with reasonable success. And you see a company like Orscheln's or Tractor Supply building out their apparel portfolio, so you can see in terms of categories, it being a bigger success when you look down on their quarterly earnings statements. Orscheln's, by the way, is a privately held company, so we don't get that much info. However, in terms of Western wear specific retailers, Boot Barn does own a huge piece of the market share in the United States. If you're looking at the entire competitive landscape, they are in fact a very large player. And that's, again, as Trent alluded to, one of the reasons why we're talking about them this week. If you look at the earnings call, this call was for their fiscal third quarter of 2020, ending on December 28th. As such, holiday sales were included in the results here. For the most part, the numbers were excellent. And as Trent also said, even though they matched earnings per share, just a lot of goings on with the company. As we discussed, earnings per share numbers on an adjusted basis met the estimates that were put forth by analysts out there. But one thing worth noting is that their unadjusted numbers were actually higher, which is something you don't often see, as the adjustments were to take into account a tax accounting benefit.
However, really, when we talk about earnings per share, yeah, they met, but it's the net and same-store sales categories where Boot Barn really shined in this quarter. The net sales for Boot Barn increased 11.8% to $284 million even in the quarter. This was due in part to expansion, but mainly a benefit from those superb comps that we've talked about. Their same-store sales increased a whopping 6.7%. That'd be whopping for any other retailer, but for Boot Barn, it was actually a little bit below where some of their recent quarters have been, in the 7 to 8% range. Now, they are anniversarying some great quarters about a year ago where they saw those double-digit same-store sales increases, so maybe not a huge surprise to see same-store sales only increase, if you will, by 6.7%. But it's even stronger given the more modest overall holiday numbers that we've seen so far from many established retailers. And we're seeing holiday numbers in general come in maybe on the lower side of guidance by some of the major organizations. Now, Boot Barn includes e-commerce in their comps. Brick and mortar by itself was up a pretty strong 5.7%. E-commerce was up 11% year over year. And we talk about a lot of companies, Target, Walmart, etc., increasing those e-commerce sales by 20% or more. And you might say, well, e-commerce up 11%, that's not going to blow anyone away. But again, as Leighton mentioned, their e-commerce presence for Boot Barn, Sheplers, and Country Outfitter is very mature. Sheplers and Country Outfitter in particular have been e-commerce pure plays now for some time after their acquisition by Boot Barn. So we're not seeing the growth there in e-commerce that you would see from a specialty retailer that is only now making that entry. And I think Boot Barn was coming from a position of strength, not only for their own website, but also for the website of Sheplers and Country Outfitter when they acquired those companies. Because, again, as Leighton referred to, Sheplers was a catalog company that was able to make that natural jump into e-commerce. They're actually in the midst of redoing the Sheplers e-commerce site to make it a little bit more intuitive, but it's always very strong for that particular brand. Now, brick and mortar sales actually outpaced e-commerce sales in growth during the first couple of quarters of this year. And again, going back to the e-commerce maturity, this speaks more to the wild success that they've had in brick and mortar versus any struggles in e-commerce for them. Comps in both categories were well over 7%. And also you look at the categories that they are selling. Now, for those that maybe haven't shopped for boots, haven't had workwear in the past, it is crucial that they fit exactly as you want. And so those products maybe also don't lend themselves to e-commerce as well as, say, like running shoes or fashion shoes or anything like that, because you need to be comfortable in that workwear. And workwear is an area where Boot Barn does a significant amount of their business, which we'll talk about a bit later on in this story. But additionally, it's clear that double-digit increases in e-commerce sales not coming at the expense of store comps. Stores still doing rather well. It appears to be a result of building market share in the Western wear category and also an increased willingness by their loyal customers to spend. And we're seeing more spend also in some of these markets they serve. Boot Barns can be in major markets, but a lot of times they're in the outlying markets, kind of on the edge of town, if you will. The Boot Barn locations nearest to me are as such. In fact, there's one right in between Colorado Springs and Denver, but it's in a little bit of a more rural location. But we're seeing these mid-sized markets, some of these smaller markets, begin to really spend money in a retail setting. And we're seeing this really borne out in some of the recent earnings calls. We've noted some strength from Hibbett over the last couple of years, same type of markets there. Now, overall, leadership was happy with improved merchandise margin in the quarter. We'll speak to this here in a moment with some of their operations and some of the things they're focusing on. They're seeing a benefit from scale too, as they saw an improvement in operating expense leverage. And this is always a question for an expanding retailer, and expanding is certainly something that Boot Barn is doing. Will they expand past what current operations can handle? We talk about distribution networks, we talk about store operations, or are they simply just growing into the size of their back-end operations? And we can see here that, at least for now, it's clearly the latter. They're growing into the size of their back-end operations, what their distribution networks can handle. They're not growing too terribly quickly. They're growing about 10% in terms of store count per year. As such, it's creating that benefit of scale there, and we see that in their bottom line.
You know, Trent, speaking of expansion, when you talk about Boot Barn, it is always a major topic of conversation on their calls. It's consistently mentioned. In fact, CEO Jim Conroy's prepared remarks led off with the confirmation that they are on track to meet their target of 10% unit growth for the fiscal year. To this end, they opened 3 stores in the quarter and have double-digit store openings planned for the fourth quarter of the fiscal year in order to meet their goal of opening 22 to 23 stores in the total fiscal year. And so you see these new store openings have proven to be successful. So they've been doing their due diligence as far as where they're going to be opening these stores, what regions of the country, what regions of the municipalities, more importantly, and at least in terms of not hindering Boot Barn's average net sales per store either, which has gone up about 5% in the last 2 quarters year over year. So these new stores, what I'm saying is they're contributing to the top line. While it takes some time to ramp up new store sales for Boot Barn, we can see that by looking at these numbers, it isn't detracting from the overall company performance on a store-by-store basis. Growth is no longer all about acquisitions as it once was. However, they are looking at what they call tuck-in acquisitions, or acquisitions that may be limited to a few stores but can easily fit into their customer base and really create some synergies, as we like to say. Also, Trent, one thing that Boot Barn has been bullish about is their customer base. So this ties in to that unit growth. They feel their customers are getting extremely loyal to their brand. This is borne out in their Be Rewarded program, where they are seeing customers not just begrudgingly use the program as with other retailers, but interact with the program on such a high level. And this user engagement, Trent, is what we talk about often in all sorts of retailers. If you think about Ulta Beauty and what they've done with their rewards program, and then other retailers that tend to not push the rewards program a whole lot in terms of marketing and advertising, but really try to test out the best practices and what customers like best. As far as the margin growth they mentioned earlier, their comments on the call echoed those made by the ICR conference in January from representatives there. First and foremost, they are seeing margin expansion because of the hardy track record of full price sales. Very rarely are they having to mark down most of their merchandise. Speaks to the level of buying power that they have, or buying expertise from their supply chain management. First, their product selection And then you see that those buyers must be getting rewarded or incentivized somehow because they have been killing it quarter after quarter, making sure that the items they are stocking are on-trend products and also the right sizes. If you think about different parts of the country, different demographics, all of those things really play into how a buyer should look at the formation of their different purchases. And if you see, Western wear is not all that different from fashion, except for the caveat that the merchandise must also typically have some utility. The second thing is lack of markdowns really speaks to the brand message Boot Barn has been able to convey around their private label products. They've been increasing their private label and exclusive brand lines, but accompanying that with effective in-store signage and marketing. They want the customer to see their exclusive brands and not just as an alternative to a national brand, but greater than those national brands in terms of quality and durability. And not to harken back to Sheplers, which again was acquired by Boot Barn. Sheplers was known for that quality. If you think Sheplers, you think workwear, and we'll get into that dynamic a little bit as to how much workwear sales make up their total apparel sales here in Boot Barn. But quality and durability is really at the core of what they're trying to sell, whether it's fashionable or not, to their customer base. As a result of their work in this particular category, their exclusive brands carry a lower markdown risk and are another reason we've seen margin expansion as sales continue to increase. An effective 1-2 punch. More margin, more revenue, more bottom line to report on these quarterly earnings calls. And to that point, they've seen 35 times growth in exclusive brand sales in dollars since fiscal year 2012, where exclusive brands made up just 2.6% of their sales in 2012. That number is now, Trent, over 20%.
20% is a pretty remarkable number for those exclusive brand sales, especially when that's just been a focus for them really over the past 8 years of the company's operations. But by the way, at that ICR conference that you mentioned, Leighton, the company almost poked fun at the perception of the rest of the country by the northeastern U.S., and you would figure that kind of happens. Most of these conferences happen in the northeastern United States, whether it be New York or another populated area. And they pointed out that populations in the Mountain West and Texas and the West Coast are all growing and don't necessarily carry the characteristics often ascribed to them by those in what we've thought of as the traditional retail powerhouse areas, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and so forth. As they usually do, Boot Barn that is, they noted the continued growing popularity of country music and rodeo. This is something they've talked about for the last several years, not only on earnings calls, but any investor presentations that they do. Underscored that the top 3 vehicles sold in the U.S. in 2019 were pickup trucks. So basically, this is their way of saying, like, hey, even though you might not be familiar with the concept or really the style of life that we are trying to market to, doesn't mean that these people don't exist in the United States. And despite the fact that Boot Barn has always appeared to have this chip on their shoulder because of that, always trying to prove their worth, we should point out that their description of U.S.-wide trends actually shows up in their sales breakdowns. By that, I mean the continued proliferation of this Western culture that you're seeing here, the Western wear culture. They've seen increased momentum in merchandise surrounding that Western aesthetic. 70% of their sales are now wrapped up in Western wear. Leighton talked about workwear. That's where the other 30% of sales come from. Workwear much made up a bigger piece of the pie there. So again, trying to get into Western fashion, trying to draw in some customers that are on those fringes, making them into those loyal return customers that they see time and again. And most of this, of course, is going to be in apparel. And this is where they see potential momentum. It currently makes up only 34% in overall sales. Again, around 50% is going to be boots and footwear. But there's potential here that the company sees not only in Western, but with some of those exclusive brands in workwear as well. And while they focus certainly on the Western aesthetic, they feel like there's also room to grow in workwear. They don't want to leave that behind. In fact, they're particularly excited about their flame-resistant line of clothing. But also, as far as apparel goes, they feel as though there's a particular opportunity in what they call Wonder West, which is kind of a category that you don't often hear about. You're not going to hear about it on like a Macy's earnings call, for example. But this is clothing, a clothing segment, usually targeting females, which may not serve as much of a functional purpose as some of the other Western wear that they sell, but it's designed to fit the Western aesthetic. part of the reason they see potential here is that for all of Boot Barn's success, only 23% of the merchandise that they sell, between boots, between clothing, between footwear, between accessories, is women's merchandise. However, they maintain that there's growth nationally in Wonder West style merchandise, whether that be at Boot Barn or elsewhere, and they want to claim a bigger piece of the pie through different marketing initiatives. So this includes the pushing of their exclusive brands. The brand Cheyenne, for example, is designed for their legacy customer, but they've also developed a brand called Idlewind to attract that expanded customer base. Again, those fringes that we're talking about in terms of their customers. They've got a marketing deal with Miranda Lambert. Makes sense for the Idlewind line, but they also want to make inroads in what they call women's contemporary, and this is where that line kind of fits in their overall marketing strategy. Now, doing so is going to be a big determining factor in their growth over the next 5 years. I think their loyal customers certainly are going to buy the workwear, going to buy the boots, but it's going to be about growing that women's portion of the pie and also children's portion of the pie, fairly small at Boot Barn as well. So growing those two categories is going to be a huge determining factor in their growth over the next 5 years. With that, our really deep dive on Boot Barn is complete. And now we're going to completely shift gears. We've got, again, a fantastic interview guest here to talk about CBD and alternative wellness products, but also increasing the knowledge for some of the retailers out there regarding these products and how those products are marketed in stores. We're back with Colby McKenzie, principal of Enlighten Wellness, after this. Leighton, oftentimes on this show, just as with today's episode, we're talking about established businesses, but ultimately, it's always interesting to look at how things get established in the first place. There's a wonderful new podcast that just came out, Climb the Ranks Quickly, reaching up into the top 15. It's a unique show, and we've never really seen a concept like this before.
No, we truly haven't. It's an experienced entrepreneur who takes people from all walks of life, mentors them, teaching them how to make money starting from zero without compromising who they are. The podcast has 50% female participants on the episodes. He has around 15 millionaire students, and it definitely shows.
The episodes are nicely edited, huge impact listening to it. It's one of the better podcasts that we've certainly heard. People have been binge listening to it, like Netflix. If you like to try out an episode to see if you like it, which I highly recommend, visit startfromzero.com/retail. Again, startfromzero.com/retail. We've talked in passing on the show about retailers adding CBD or other wellness products or seeking to add those type of products, but usually this is in the context of earnings calls and the like, so it's never been super in-depth, but we're going to change that today. We're joined by Colby McKenzie. He's the principal of Enlighten Wellness, a firm comprised of pharmacy owners, marketing professionals, and retail and technology experts. Enlighten Wellness assists independent retailers with their entry into the wellness space, but particularly the CBD space, which will kind of be the focus of today's interview. Colby, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast.
You bet. Happy to be here.
So first, I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about what Enlighten does on kind of a day-to-day there.
Yeah, of course. So at its core, Enlighten Wellness serves its retail partners as a category manager for alternative health products. However, unlike a traditional category manager or distributor, Enlighten uses its incredible retail technology to create a true store-within-a-store concept that we call the Enlighten Wellness Center. And this leverages a television screen sitting atop a product end cap to promote its products and provide general education on popular new products such as CBD.
So really, we're talking about, managing those products and the product's presence inside the retail stores, including CBD. But I just want to start with the general wellness products that you work with. First of all, can you speak to the rise that we've seen as far as not only CBD, but all of these alternative medicine products that are covered in these stores?
Yeah, and as a fitness and health buff myself, this has always been something that's been near and dear to my heart and something that I've tracked closely. But I think what you've seen over the last, let's call it 10 years, is really an unearthing of the fact that there are other ways to stay healthy, and more so than trying to cure something that is already ailing you. People have begun to really focus on preventative health. And a lot of times preventative health is centered around these alternative health remedies. And I think that has really been the key to the rise of this. And it's been exciting to watch as somebody that has a longstanding regimen of taking and utilizing these alternative health supplements. I think it's really fun to see it kind of become mainstream.
Now, of course, your firm works with a number of different retailers, most of them independent. I was wondering what some of the misconceptions were surrounding maybe CBD or alternative medicine products for some of these retail companies that you work with.
Yeah, so it's really two buckets of retailers. You have the retailers that have gone out and educated themselves and really understand that this is a fast-growing industry and a fast-growing product line as far as CPG goes, and are jumping in feet first, and in doing so, quickly realize, oh no, I might not have the education or the background to really thrive in this category. And those are the ones that we kind of hold their hand and really serve as that true category manager to help them kind of navigate this industry. Whereas you have the other bucket, which is quite the opposite. And these retailers are oftentimes a little less educated on alternative remedies, and in fact view them either as snake oil, or they see CBD and say, well, isn't that cannabis? And that can't be something that we have in our store. And with those, it really becomes education that we oftentimes are delivering to the consumer, backing that up a step and actually providing that same level of education to our retail partners to say, wait a second, I think maybe you have some preconceived notions or misnomers about alternative health as a whole and CBD in particular. And with those, it's just a matter of properly educating them. And then all of a sudden you see the light kind of switch on with those guys. And we turn around and say, now what we've done with you, let's do that with your customers and really provide that baseline of education for them.
Now, I know Enlighten does a lot of your primary work with independent retailers, thus the wide variance that you might see in terms of preconceived notions there. But I was wondering how the approach differs as far as dealing with independent retailers, trying to get them up to speed and making sure that they're seeing success in this category versus maybe a way a big box store might merchandise and market these products.
You bet. And so one of our kind of core mantras as we embarked on Enlighten Wellness was really seeing this gap in kind of the retail technology and the way that retailers approach their storefront, and seeing this big gap between, as you've mentioned, big box and the independents. We wanted to offer these independents a tool that allowed them to really try and compete head to head with the big box. And so when it comes to, we'll use pharmacy as an example. You oftentimes walk into an independent pharmacy and they are top-notch pharmacists, but really a lot of times maybe have neglected or just don't focus on their front of store, when in reality your margins are big on front of store and your customers are already in the store ready to buy other products. So it just takes us stepping in and saying, how about we provide you with this retail technology tool that's going to essentially serve as an unpaid employee for you, that's going to be able to speak to these products that happen to be sitting right there on the shelf below the screen. And that understanding, and all of a sudden they say, wait, I can now compete with these big box retailers. I can now move into the 21st century retail and begin to be that experiential retailer, a place that becomes a destination more so than just a peddler of goods. And all of a sudden they kind of say, all right, if you're going to be that tool for me to compete with the big box, I'm all ears.
Now, we talk about these tools, of course. A lot of them have to do with the use of video there, in addition to the merchandising in the store. You mentioned the need to educate retailers sometimes, but what portion of being a successful retailer of CBD products has to do with that educational aspect, with providing the education to the consumer? And also, what type of feedback, what type of interactivity are you seeing with that video that you're providing in store as well?
Yeah, and it really becomes, to your point, a three-pronged approach. One, you have to have really great products and best-in-class products that not only are top-of-the-line quality, but also really have great branding. And then on top of that, you have to have those products that are in an easy to access spot. You don't want to be in the far away dark corner. You want to be somewhere that's high traffic, easy access. And then kind of the cherry on top and really what differentiates us and has allowed us to see really incredible sales velocity figures is, to your point, the educational component. So sitting atop our Enlighten Wellness Center is going to be a screen that plays an array of education. And a lot of times when retailers think of digital signage, they immediately kind of have their eyes glaze over and start to think like, oh, it's going to play these 3 clips over and over and put everybody to sleep. So what we've done is our technology is actually very dynamic. So it's constantly pulling from a massive library and Rolodex of content specifically tailored to the products in that location. And it's going as far as providing trivia questions to kind of playfully ease you into the education process, all the way to kind of deeper dive understanding of here is an alternative remedy. Here's where it comes from. Here's the people that it might benefit and things of that nature. And all of a sudden you create this connection between education and purchase. Somebody that's highly educated all of a sudden becomes not only more likely to purchase, but more likely to be a very loyal purchaser and return to that place in which they received the education. And that's something that we've seen prove out over the course of time with Enlighten Wellness.
Well, and that's great news. Just a little bit about myself. About 20 years ago, I worked in a drugstore, and we had a video monitor there talking about muscadine grape juice, and it played the same clip, 3-minute clip, over and over and over again. So good to hear that it's pulling from a larger repository. One other thing you mentioned in that response, though, was you mentioned it really does come down to having a good product on the shelves. And I know you work with a number of product suppliers there. What's the process like? I'm kind of curious as far as vetting these products, especially in an industry that's relatively new, relatively recent when we're talking about CBD.
Yes, and it's been an interesting ride and something that we at the beginning said if we're stamping these products with the Enlighten Wellness kind of approval, we sure as heck better vet them really well. So we came up with a 7-step vetting process that's extremely rigorous, particularly on the CBD side. As you mentioned, you've had a lot of fly-by-night companies that kind of come and go, and really an issue with people creating products that don't even have enough CBD to benefit people in the way that is perhaps something that's out there benefiting these CBD consumers. And so what we do is we have really a couple pieces of the puzzle. One is the product has to be good looking, because when it's a new category, people are a little hesitant. But if it's a good looking product and one that kind of fits what people are interested in, you get their attention. But at the same time, if the product doesn't work or doesn't kind of meet the expectation of the consumer, then you're not going to get that repurchase. And so we're really, really hard on the process of making sure that what these SKUs claim to have in the product is actually in there. And that's kind of the process we go about creating kind of consistency, but also easing the mind of our retailers, because going out on your own as a retailer and going through this vetting process and having to deal with a number of potential product companies becomes a heavy lift. But when you rely on somebody that's already providing kind of a full integrated system that includes those products, then all of a sudden it takes that burden off of them, places it on us, and that's one that we're happy to carry.
And I am kind of interested because, being kind of a subject matter expert in this particular field, you work with a number of different retailers in a number of different parts of the country. And of course, not every market's going to be the same, but you also serve a number of small markets as well. When we're talking about setting up this interview, this is something that really piques our interest on the show, is serving those small markets. How or to what extent does your approach change when it goes from, maybe setting up in market A versus market B, or a large versus small market?
To give a little background on that, we actually are in 19 states and serve a number of different retail types. We work with pharmacies, we work with natural food stores, and we recently have started working with grocery stores. So to your point, no two kind of parts of the country are alike, let alone no two types of retailers. And so we really take a very hands-on approach, because we've learned that, for example, we're working with kind of a regional Oregon and California chain right now. that has two different laws as far as CBD between Oregon and California. And on top of that, has two very different demographics between customers in those two markets. So even within this one customer, we are tailoring and fine-tuning the products that go on the shelf to fit that demographic and, more importantly, to fit the legal kind of framework of each state. And then you take that on kind of a macro level, and not only are we really vetting and providing that category management on the products, but you also have to make sure that you're backing that up with education that fits that type of retailer. So the education that we're putting out there in a pharmacy may be a little more cut and dry and a little more focused on kind of true fact-based education, whereas something that may be in a grocery store may be a little more engaging and playful and have trivia along with kind of fact-based education. So we kind of are very, very tailored in our approach, and you almost have to be when you're working across this variety of kind of geographic diversity as well as retailer diversity. And I think it's kind of one of our core competencies that has allowed us to be very successful when it comes to sell-through.
And I wanted to close out with this because, as we've talked about several times during the course of this interview, you work largely with independent retailers, and it's said oftentimes that they have the flexibility to be a bit more nimble than obviously a huge, enormous national chain. How do you feel like that assists them in terms of the ability to introduce not only new lines of products, but new forms of that in-store marketing to advertise newer products, whether they be CBD or other alternative wellness solutions?
And I'll give you an example through a story, actually, and this just proves why independents, to your point, are nimble, and it does serve as a huge advantage. One of our regional sales reps was out in the field last month and just happened to stop by a really beautiful pharmacy. And they walk in, and this place is a great-looking pharmacy, and they walk up to the pharmacist who happened to be there that day and say, I have a solution for you that will fit right over in that part of the pharmacy. Aesthetically, it'll fit right in, and this is going to not only provide you with this cool retail tool, but I'm also willing to pull these products out of kind of the vehicle that I came in on, stick them on your shelf today, and you can take a look. And if this looks like something that fits, and if it looks like the products that you're willing to sell, I will literally walk out of here today and you can have this, and we can go from there. And sure enough, that would never happen in a big box. They would laugh at you and say, why don't you go through the multiple chains and multiple processes in order for this to be vetted? Whereas this independent pharmacist saw it sitting there and said, wow, that does look good. Where do I sign? Let's get this going. And sure enough, within 2 weeks, we're in all three of his locations. And it just kind of, the story I found resonates with the fact that independents sometimes forget that they have that advantage, to your point, of being nimble and being able to move quickly. And this really helps out in a number of ways, including getting up and running with us.
Finally, simply because you are so in tune with the industry, obviously this is a growing retail segment, whether it's CBD or alternative wellness solutions. Where do you see the future of this heading over the next 5-10 years?
I think you're going to see continued annual growth across not only CBD, which has absolutely been on fire, but funny enough, still isn't reaching from an education and understanding point, even half of America at this point. But at the same time, alternative wellness has this kind of groundswell that you're seeing more and more people say, how do I prevent? How do I prevent? I want to be healthy more so than just fixing problems. And I think that you're going to continue to see really rapid growth, but also an uncovering of a lot of really cool and unique new remedies in the coming years. And that's something that I think everybody should be excited for, but particularly independents, because they can rely on experts and really lean into these trends and be first movers, which serves them well.
Fascinating information. Once again, Colby McKenzie, principal of Enlighten Wellness. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Retail Focus podcast.
You bet. Happy to be here.
Well, once again, we thank Colby McKenzie from Enlighten Wellness for appearing on the show. That was a great conversation. Really learned a lot, not only about how their products are being received throughout the country, but also about some of the unique aspects with those independent retailers. You can check out their website, by the way, if you just want to see those products kind of in action, see some of those end caps they were talking about. It's enlightenwellness.com. enlightenwellness.io is the website, enlightenwellness.io, and some pretty neat displays that they've got. It's not just simply like sticking a television on an end cap. They really do have some unique displays that, again, pull from a larger repository of videos. And I can't tell you, as a former retail employee myself, well, as a current retail employee, a little bit here and there as well, how much that is crucial for the employees. They don't want to hear the same video time and again. Customers don't want to hear it if they're a regular customer as well at places like those local pharmacies. So interesting concept there. But again, we're going to keep our eye on that industry as it continues to grow. And we continue actually, this is more of a natural segue with a retailer that has embraced alternative health products in Natural Grocers as they released earnings this week. More accurately, I guess we should call them Natural Grocers by Vitamin Cottage, but more often than not, people know them as just Natural Grocers. And we felt it pertinent to cover this call because we've been discussing a lot in the natural and organic segment with the bankruptcy of Lucky's Markets. We've talked about it the last couple of weeks, and actually we got word of more closings, which we'll talk about later on during this story. Natural Grocers, one of those companies fighting for market share in this space. Lately, they've been doing so by focusing on underserved markets in the Mountain West. It seems like we're talking a lot about the Mountain West today on the show, leading off with Boot Barn there. As with our first retailer we covered on the show in Boot Barn, if you live in the eastern United States, you might not be familiar with Natural Grocers. They have a total of 156 stores in 20 states. They are a growing concept. Most of these stores are west of the Mississippi, but they did just open their first store in Louisiana during this quarter as they continue to push eastward. However, they've drawn our attention in the past for their aggressive growth plans, but they have a more Spartan overall concept than the likes of a Lucky's or a Whole Foods. There's no grocerants in the stores, just a well-curated selection of organics, vegan products, and supplements. So think about them somewhere in between the two poles of Aldi on one end, where there's not much merchandising, there's not much marketing at all, there's very little experience in the store, if you will, to Whole Foods at the other end of it, where you've got all of this stuff going on. They're somewhere in between that in terms of the overall shopping experience, but because they're not as all-inclusive as Whole Foods, it allows them to expand a little bit more quickly and draw in customers that maybe don't want to cross the threshold of going into a Whole Foods in terms of their price points.
For me personally, my first experience with Natural Grocers, Trent, was where I grew up in Wichita, Kansas, and a Natural Grocers actually opened up in an old Borders bookstore. So when Borders closed, Natural Grocers didn't take over the lease. They renegotiated, got into this particular space, and then actually sublet a part of the space to a restaurant. So this Natural Grocers was a little bit unique, but that was my first taste of what they had to offer. If we dig into those earnings, we would say that they posted a beat on earnings, but there were no analyst estimates to go off of in the Zacks consensus repository. As it is, they came through with adjusted earnings of around 8 cents per share in their first fiscal quarter of 2020. The lack of analyst attention paid to Natural Grocers also showed on the call. There was just one analyst who had 2 questions. It is what it is, and their numbers were generally solid given that lack of attention, given the other news in this space, which we've been covering and that Trent had alluded to. So much going on in this particular niche in grocery. They do track comp sales differently by looking at average daily comps. This metric was up 1.9% over the first quarter of 2019. However, the main driver in this segment wasn't food, but rather came from the supplements category. So we talk about vitamins and health products, different types of anti-aging products as well, some of the things they sell. Supplements grew 3.4% on a comps basis versus last year. They actually noted last quarter that they see supplements as a major area of opportunity for the next year or so. Along with the continued addition of new stores to their base, this parlayed itself into a net sales increase of 3.8%. And to be fair, growth of their store footprint slowed in 2019's calendar year, with an overall growth rate in their footprint of just 2.6%. If you look at some of the underlying numbers here, there might be cause for concern, except that there appears to be an easy explanation for them in each of these areas. For example, store expenses increased 4.7% year over year and increased 20 basis points as a percentage of sales. Gross margin also decreased from 26.7% to 26.3% year over year. However, both of these numbers, while not appearing good on the surface, were solely attributable to a new lease accounting standard that they took in for this first fiscal quarter. And you see, as such, gross profit actually increased by 1.4 million year over year, largely attributable to that increase in comps. Again, they feel as though there is really more headspace available for sales given current store costs. However, their EBITDA was down slightly despite interest expense being significantly reduced.
Let's talk now about their expansion plans, as the company revealed more modest plans than we're perhaps used to from them for the upcoming calendar year. The company opened a net of just 4 new stores in 2019, but they're expecting total openings for 2020 to be around 5 to 6, so a modest number in terms of what they're used to, but still growth instead of that pullback that we're seeing from other companies. Now, the openings won't be far out of their wheelhouse. We talked about the one location opening in Louisiana, but the new stores that are planned coming up, you're looking at 1 new store each for Colorado, New Mexico, Oregon, Utah, and Washington, specifically in Spokane there in Washington. That Spokane store is actually slated to open later this month here in February. Now, leases and property have already been acquired for all of these stores, and obviously the Spokane store is about ready to open. So we're fairly certain that these stores will open by the conclusion of the year, barring something crazy or catastrophic happening for them. However, the markets they're eyeing do signal a bit of a return to larger markets for them, because we're looking at larger cities here, or at least larger markets than we'd seen in 2017 and 2018, where they were entering a lot of small and mid-sized markets, particularly in mountain towns. They also want to relocate a handful of stores during the year, so some of their older stores that are maybe in spots or maybe in square footprints that they would rather adjust. Now, their identity as kind of a Mountain West retailer was on display during the earnings call. I've never heard a company be so excited about marketing partnerships with ski resorts. But in talking about their marketing for the quarter, they were really focused on those. Co-president Kemper Isley noted partnerships with Steamboat and Winter Park resorts as being something they hope will be key as ski season continues for them. Not all about getting the message across necessarily for right now. They don't expect people to leave the ski resorts and go right to a Natural Grocers. But again, it's about that top of mind awareness, trying to set things up for strength in the spring and summer months. Other marketing efforts include expanded billboard and outdoor advertising, which is kind of interesting to think. Billboards have been around for forever, and yet well-established retail brands keep going to that well because it seems to be working. We've been talking about other retailers kind of moving their advertising to digital, but here we've got Natural Grocers really talking about going back to billboard and outdoor for some of their marketing dollars. Now, as far as other internal targets for growth within the company, they did release expectations for sales in the upcoming year. They see a broad swath of comps, so coming in at an increase of around 0.5% to 2.5%. Additionally, they eye net income as a percentage of sales of around 0.9% to 1.1%. That's not the greatest in grocery retail, but it is still in the positive, which is something that we haven't seen from all operators in this space. Grocery margins are, of course, going to be less robust than what you see in the general merchandise space, but still, this is a little bit on the lower end for them, and it should produce diluted earnings per share numbers of 37 cents to 45 cents. At least that's what they expect for this next year. We did want to touch briefly on other natural and organics news, as Earth Fare announced wholesale closures of their stores just a couple of weeks after the Lucky's news. In fact, we're going to see 50 stores closed. Earth Fare had most of their stores in the southeastern United States and was a main competitor to Lucky's in Florida with a similar concept. Although having been to both, I'm going to maintain that Lucky's had a bit more of a differentiated concept, and part of that might be due to the age of some of the Earth Fare stores. But Kelly Bania of BMO Capital Markets, an analyst, said that it's a sign and a note that the outlook for smaller grocers is becoming, and I quote, increasingly challenging because of the digital food retail landscape. Now, personally, we find this a bit of a mischaracterization of the issues facing Lucky's, because remember, Lucky's had Kroger pull its support out from under them, and also Earth Fare, especially given the extremely small percentage of grocery sales that touch a digital channel currently. And we just talked about a grocer that's doing just fine in Natural Grocers that doesn't have a huge digital channel themselves. I don't think it's digital that's causing the issue for these grocers. In fact, I believe, or I am inclined to believe at least, the issue more likely stems from price competition and shrinking margins. During the Q&A on their earnings call, going back to Natural Grocers, they noted that while there wasn't an acceleration in promotions during this last quarter, they did see pricing get more competitive. And when you look at the landscape as a whole, the competition is particularly ramping up in organic produce and other fresh products, which for Earth Fare was a major component of their product selection.
Unlike Lucky's, Earth Fare was part of the first generation of natural and organics retailers, having been founded in 1975. They were purchased by a private equity firm, however, in 2012. CEO Frank Scorpaniti had actually said recently that Earth Fare was the only grocer left in America where customers could feel secure about what they were bringing home, and said that they were seeking to double their store count in the U.S. by 2024. It turns out that maybe Americans didn't care so much about his claims, or at least felt secure enough with the other retailers they were buying their groceries from. That access to capital, he touted, evaporated, and the company was attempting, at least, to restructure its debt. They had trouble finding takers, and we fast forward, they will attempt to go the same path as Lucky's, liquidating merchandise and attempting to sell locations or their current leases. They may be in a better position from a lease perspective than Lucky's, but given the purported length of the leases for many of the locations, we can see that there are maybe some locations with less liability. Since several Earth Fare locations were older, their leases might be in shorter length. It is also said that they owned several of their locations, which is always very helpful to the balance sheet. And in times like this, when you have to liquidate, you're short on cash, you're in a liquidity crisis, you own your own stores, you can do a number of things with those opportunities. And you see a remarkable swath of Lucky's locations and leases have already been purchased. Earth Fare's position of being second to the party might hinder their work in this regard. And this was something we had talked about with Lucky's. Who is going to take over their leases? Several retailers already raising their hands there.
And we would be remiss if we didn't cover Simon Property Group on the show, as we discussed to lead off. Although we've mentioned them in other recent stories on the podcast, like last week, discussing their exposure to Forever 21 and that discussion of Tanger outlets, we haven't given them their own story in quite some time. And the story this week was their end of 2019 financial results, as well as an ever important update on their overall portfolio. We're going to get into that. Also, hey, there's an update on the Forever 21 front as well. They'd been rumored to be potentially a bidder for Forever 21 in bankruptcy, and we'll have an update on that during this story as well. Now, as most of our listeners know, Simon is one of the largest traditional mall operators in the U.S., although they do have other retail real estate holdings. As far as the earnings were concerned, things didn't look quite as robust as they did for the company last year. Net income attributable to common stockholders was down to $1.66 per diluted share in this quarter, which was their fourth quarter for this last year. This was compared to $2.30 per diluted share for the fourth quarter of 2018. So a fairly steep decline there, but funds from operations did not see as large a decrease. So this is kind of what you typically think of as earnings per share for a REIT, coming in at $2.96 per diluted share. This compared favorably to analyst expectations of $2.95 per share, but was down from the $3.23 mark they posted last year. When you whittle it down, though, to comparable funds from operations, things do look a little bit better. There was indeed growth of 4.4% year over year, basically discounting operations, or real estate in this case, that was either acquired or divested in the past year. And Leighton, numbers are great, but that isn't why we're here. We're here to take a look at their overall operations as a whole at this juncture.
Yeah, we love to talk about retail, but anytime it intersects with commercial real estate, we love it even more. And so hence the reason for the story. For their malls and premium outlets, Simon is looking at some of the underlying retail numbers here. They should be pretty excited. They're amazingly strong as of late. And you see these numbers are exclusive to their U.S. malls and premium outlets, as Simon does have international holdings. Reported retailer sales per square foot was $693 for the 2019 fiscal year, which was an increase of 4.8% over 2018. And if you actually think about that number, Trent, that's more or less in line with how much retail sales during the holiday season jumped up as well. So things are looking good for the tenants in their spaces. This number is reflective of how well those individual businesses which lease space from Simon Property Group, how they are doing. How much traffic are they seeing year over year, and how much traffic is converting to actual sales dollars. Everything's looking very good. And this was actually unexpected in terms of that overall increase, especially given the media's willingness to bash malls. This number far outpaces inflation and speaks to a potential growing strength in their holdings. That inflation number, by the way, just reported 1.8%. So not that high at all. Occupancy wasn't too strong as what Tanger reported last week, but still a decent 95.1% at the end of last year. Tanger, that was an interesting story, wasn't it, Trent? Shopping centers, outlet malls, all doing better than expected. Leasing spread, by the way, for Simon was $7.83 in 2019, an increase of 14.4% over 2018. For those who are unfamiliar with real estate terms, spreads are essentially the difference between rent per square foot on a new lease versus the rent per square foot on the prior lease in the same exact space. Again, we can't say it enough. Retail rents are going up, and this is a bad thing for a lot of those tenants, but it really speaks again to how the retail industry has been doing. And some retailers don't necessarily have the renegotiation leverage now that they seem to believe they do. And this really pertains to the stories that we've been seeing with conventional malls, wherein maybe struggling retailers with a much larger footprint can have that negotiation power. But if you're talking about a mall that's doing very well with a retailer that only needs 2,000 or 3,000 square feet, good luck in trying to negotiate that lease in the downward trajectory. It is important to note that looking at the spread only gives part of the overall story, since it only speaks to new leases versus old leases. So we have to take that into consideration and may not include flat or slightly increasing lease bumps in ongoing leases. We talk about option periods occasionally on this show. Typically, a retailer will sign on for maybe 5 years in a mall space, but then have 2 or 3 year options thereafter. With those options, you're optioning in or out to stay in that space. If you option in, sometimes you'll see an escalation that is well above inflation, and that, of course, could help a company like Simon Property Group. They are attempting to continue to build on these numbers by going knee deep into a variety of redevelopment projects in the U.S. They have 15 ongoing redevelopments across their portfolio currently, including Northgate in Seattle, Phipps Plaza in Atlanta, and Burlington Mall in Massachusetts. They are expanding the shops at Riverside in New Jersey and Sawgrass Mills in Miami. Between redevelopment and expansion, they had 30 projects, Trent, ongoing internationally at the end of 2019, for which they are going on the hook for around $1.8 billion. You see, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money to be reinvesting into your overall business. But if you are a director of real estate operations, you know that malls are not dying. And everyone will say this, but stagnant malls that are not reinvesting, not finding new and diverse tenants, they are seeing traffic declines. But by and large, Simon's portfolio has done very well and really identifying the malls that need a little bit of work, a little bit of refreshing, some new carpet here or there. And actually, we grew up around a mall that had recently, within the last 5 years, Trent, had really redeveloped, and you can see that they're almost at full occupancy despite a recent Sears closure. Everything's going very well for them, and that mall has been alive for roughly 42 years. So this really speaks to the idea that management is being very competent and they know their portfolio in and out, and well enough at least to deploy something like the $1.8 billion in capital. This is a massive chunk for their overall portfolio, as they have just over 230 properties overall. They also, by the way, have one new project in the U.S. currently, the Tulsa Premium Outlets in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which are scheduled to open in 2021.
And I wanted to take a few moments to just touch on the quoted deal between Forever 21 and Simon, among a couple of other properties. Forever 21, as our listeners likely know, had been in Chapter 11 bankruptcy. They reached a deal this week or earlier this week to sell off assets for $81 million. And the deal was to a consortium of Simon Property Group, Brookfield Properties, and also Authentic Brands Group, who's been in on a couple of other purchases, most notably the purchase of Barney's out of bankruptcy. And this deal will include its remaining stores, its e-commerce site, its beauty line, and other assets for Forever 21. Now, this group has been designated basically as the stalking horse bidder, meaning it's still subject to approval by a judge. Other potential buyers had until February 7th to place bids for Forever 21. We did not hear of a bid by that point in time, but because the 7th was a Friday, sometimes the news cycle won't reveal that until this next week. So by the time you're listening to it, this information might be completely incorrect. But generally speaking, as we were following up on it Friday, heard nothing new about a potential bid. Now, as far as Forever 21 is concerned, we talked again about them last week and about the amount of exposure Simon has to Forever 21. 98 stores in its portfolio of around 230, as Leighton mentioned. Actually, I believe it's up to 233 now. But that's a huge blow to them if all of them were to close. However, it is important to note that they're the sixth or tied for the sixth largest retailer by rents in Simon's properties. And this is according to a nice deep dive by the Motley Fool this week. Overall, though, in terms of square footage, it is the third largest retailer in Simon's portfolio, meaning that if you're Simon, you really don't want those stores to go vacant. Although, as Leighton spoke to, we're seeing Simon redevelop a lot of the closed down Sears, but I think Simon is trying to avoid, in this circumstance, multiple redevelopments in a shorter period of time. Now, this has worked in the past, and we've talked about the idea behind retail landlords in the past purchasing these stores, but I think Simon's desire to do this was again fueled by the fact that you don't want to necessarily leave these spaces any emptier than they need to be, but also it comes down to a PR thing at some point, because if you have more articles out there about malls going empty and all of these locations closing, it's going to deter people ultimately from going to those malls if that news becomes so pervasive. Obviously, it's more pervasive than it probably should be. Leighton spoke to all of the solid results from retailers in these Simon properties, but again, it makes sense to some extent for Simon as long as they don't sink too much money into it. And again, they're only one of 3 partners in it with Brookfield and Authentic Brands. One other thing we wanted to mention in terms of Simon is they recently announced that Happy Returns was fully rolled out in 52 of their shopping centers, so nearly a quarter of their shopping centers throughout the U.S. And basically, Happy Returns, of course, again, a lot of our listeners probably know, but basically a return service for e-commerce retailers. You can take the return without repackaging it, all that stuff, to the Happy Returns location at the Simon Mall and get compensation for your return right there. You don't have to wait for refunds. But Simon, really happy with this partnership. It started in 2017 as just a pilot at a few locations. So now completed that recent expansion, and you would have to think Simon looking at further expansion of this concept. But again, Happy Returns is one part or one component of what Simon is looking to do as they continue to push a lot of these shopping centers towards not just retail, but services, entertainment, and other categories as well. So just another different use for the space. Seems to be a symbiotic relationship so far, but we did want to mention that had been fully expanded now to 52 mall locations.
As always, we may have a position in or against companies we discuss on the podcast. Do not invest in stocks solely on the input of the podcast hosts.
We've reached the final segment of the Retail Focus podcast, where each Leighton and I take a look at a story we're keeping an eye on for the next week, month, or perhaps year. And we begin with Leighton.
My looking ahead has to do with the convenience store sector and 7-Eleven, which is a powerhouse retailer that we love to talk about on the podcast. And Trent often talks about how convenience stores do really well, by and large, due to the amount of gross margin they're able to extract for each individual location. And if you see here, 7-Eleven massively successful in the US, but also internationally. They have over 60,000 locations internationally, almost 8,500 locations throughout the United States. They do business in a number of states, and you see they're widely successful. This story has to do with not their growth, their unit growth that they've been seeing, and the new types of buying power that they have in buying some of their competitors as of late, but you see that 7-Eleven in their headquarters in Irving, Texas, is trying out a 700 square foot non-traditional store that's going to be cashierless. So they're going to implement a number of new technologies within this store to be like, you guessed it, an Amazon Go location. However, this is maybe one of the biggest things we've seen in the convenience store space for some time because of 7-Eleven's size. And this is why it's my looking ahead trend. It's because with having almost 8,500 stores in the US, to be able to leverage this technology, if successful, if done right, if executed appropriately over the next 2 to 3 years, could be a true game changer. Because while Amazon Go is usually in only locations, the very few locations they have are in areas of really good demographics, the stores are a little bit bigger, and they serve just a different population than 7-Eleven. And by the way, they only have a few stores compared to the over 8,000 that 7-Eleven has. So if they're able to leverage this technology, what I'm saying basically is that a number of things could happen. It could reduce their overhead costs because, yes, there is that upfront implementation of such technologies because the upfront cost there with the design and build out of these systems. But if you're talking about having to pay employees and reducing all of the things associated with having to have people there at the store checking people out, you would be saving on that amount of money. Also, with data and analytics, it seems like that would seamlessly integrate with all of their inventory systems, making things a little bit better. Some of their stores, some of those 7-Eleven stores, you can see that I don't know if they all share one point of sale system, but I feel like it's always a lag time when you're checking out. You insert your debit or credit card. It takes a while for things to run appropriately. With this 700 square foot pilot store, everything looks clean. Everything looks straightforward. And again, this is a pilot location, so it's all with a grain of salt. But according to the company, they're using proprietary algorithms and predictive technology to identify the different baskets of goods that customers are coming in and out of the store with. And this store, by the way, I did mention at their company headquarters, it is only used right now for those people that work for the company that have the 7-Eleven's mobile app. So just like with Amazon Go, it works with your smartphone and it tracks the merchandise that you have inside your shopping cart, and then it charges those customers, in this case, company employees, with whatever you had put in your basket when you're out the store. And I think this really is going to reduce friction long term if they're able to implement this into the other stores throughout the United States. But then also, I think 7-Eleven has to be pragmatic about it. And let's say this technology is successful and within a year and a half or 2 years, they implement in some locations. They're going to have to be very careful and thoughtful as to which stores adopt this type of technology because, let's face it, some stores see higher shrink than others. And I think this could be a little bit of a burden, maybe not as cost effective as in some markets with nicer 7-Eleven stores or maybe new developments. Maybe if 7-Eleven is opening in a particular region of the country, those new stores, it would behoove them to just go ahead and implement the technology up front, thus saving switching costs later on down the road. But as for now, that is my looking ahead story. Curious to see how this works out. Again, if you're maybe in Irving, Texas, you can look at it, but you can't actually go in it to see how it works. But 7-Eleven cashierless stores, is it the wave of the future?
My looking ahead story is actually kind of a reverse from what Leighton was talking about, as a grocery chain, a fairly large grocery chain in the upper Midwest, is announcing that most of their stores will cease 24/7 operations. They'll close from midnight to 5 a.m. This was first reported by the Argus Leader in South Dakota, and we're talking about Hy-Vee. This was first noted in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which, by the way, if you've never been, I went for the first time last year. I was there on a business trip. Phenomenal city, great downtown. Highly recommend it, Sioux Falls, South Dakota. But the Hy-Vee stores there will begin closing from midnight to 5 a.m. And then after it was asked of a Hy-Vee spokesperson, Christina Guyman said that the change will affect most of Hy-Vee's other 265 stores. So we're talking about a fairly substantial regional chain. Their swath really cuts from Kansas and Missouri in the south up to Minnesota in the north and the Dakotas as well. But we're starting to see this movement away for Hy-Vee. They said, well, basically it's not worth it. You're looking at shrink as something that Leighton mentioned in the 7-Eleven story, but overall, you're looking at also a situation where you're not bringing in the funds that would be required to staff the store in an overnight capacity. Now, non-public facing employees will still work overnight, doing resets, that type of thing, certainly changing over ads and all of that overnight employees have always done at retail stores. But again, you're looking at a number of retailers pushing to do this over the past 5 years. We're seeing an increase in Walgreens locations, for example, and CVS locations no longer being open 24 hours because it doesn't make financial sense. Who's next in this? Target has never been open 24 hours necessarily, but Walmart certainly has, and most Walmart locations are. Is this something that's going to trickle its way down to Walmart locations? Most neighborhood markets are already not open 24 hours. Who else is going to be next on the 24-hour push? Is it going to be a chain like, for example, a convenience store, which may not see it worthwhile to be open overnight? Overall, though, we're seeing just a pushback from retailers in terms of needing to be open 24/7. You wonder how that's going to certainly impact them. It might impact them favorably, certainly in terms of saving funds. But part of the reason I'm looking at this story is, there's still a significant number of second and third shift workers in the U.S., and it creates an issue for these second and third shift workers depending on when they do their shopping. If you get off, let's say, at 1 a.m., there becomes no place to run errands, no place to pick up, if you're down a gallon of milk or something like that. So it also affects those particular workers and the quality of life in the U.S. as you have these stores closing down and going away from the 24/7 concept. So not only am I looking at which retailer is going to be next, but I'm wondering if there's going to be retailers that's going to see this and capitalize on it and maybe use it in marketing materials as well. Well, that'll do it for us here on the Retail Focus podcast, a widely varied show today. We went from Western wear to natural and organics. We talked about CBD with our fantastic interview guest, Colby McKenzie of Enlighten Wellness. And we closed out the show by talking about retail real estate in 7-Eleven. So a little bit of everything today. We'll be back 1 week from now. Got another great interview lined up. Can't wait for that show.
This has been the Retail Focus Podcast. For more, visit our website at retailfocuspodcast.com and subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher. Follow us on Twitter at Retail Podcast.